Welcome, Crystal Warriors, to the Crystarium Network's Top 10 NES RPGs. In no way are we doing this to jump on the popular bandwagon that are the top 10 YouTube videos. While several factors are taken into account while creating this list, much of it is influenced by my own personal judgment, so without any hesitation, let's get right on into it.
Number 10. Final Fantasy II.
A truly underrated game. When mentioning Final Fantasy, this game almost never surfaces, which is a shame. Originally, Final Fantasy II was released in Japan only. It was developed by Squaresoft and released in 1988. It follows the superb Final Fantasy I game. Final Fantasy II introduced much of what we know about the Final Fantasy franchise today, such as Chocobos, Cid, the Evil Empire, and things like that. Perhaps most importantly, though, is that the game is a sequel to Final Fantasy, but in name only. This game is essentially completely different than Final Fantasy I, with the battle system and, more importantly, the narrative. This trend will continue throughout the series. The original game's leveling system was completely scrapped and replaced with a gradual leveling system, depending on how you approached battles. If you've ever played an Elder Scrolls game, it's something like that. I personally love the game, and I think it's a shame that it gets mentioned so little. The music is fantastic. Like other most early Final Fantasy games, this does have several remakes spanning the Game Boy Advance, PSP, and PlayStation 1, so go check it out.
Number 9. Bard's Tale.
A very early computer role-playing game developed by Interplay Productions, A Bard's Tale didn't originate on the NES, but was ported after release. Bard's Tale does not resemble your typical console role-playing game due to it being developed for a personal computer. The game is nice, and the faux 3D is incredibly impressive for the time. The game has a heavy first-person dungeon scroll aspect. This definitely set the stage for many more of these first-person games to come. The game is quite text-heavy, which some may be turned off by, but there's no denying the polish that went into this game. You control up to 6 party members and they have particular classes, and you're adventuring through the world, just like your standard RPG fare. The story is almost as basic as you can get, featuring the ragtag group of adventurers to save the day, but again, it is executed very well.
Number 8. Ultima 4. Quest of the Avatar.
Ultima 4 was developed by Origin Systems, and like the previous entry, the game did not begin on the NES, but it was ported to it later. The graphics and music on the NES port were completely overhauled. Dialogue options were reduced and party composition went from 7 to 4. Those changes almost make the game look completely different than what it originally was. The game's battle system is more akin to what you might find in a pencil and paper RPG, with you moving around on a battlefield rather than being in a static combat view as seen in most JRPGs at the time. The game was the gold standard before a few other little titles that came along that you might have heard of. Fans are divided about which version of the game is the best, but I believe the NES version has its merits. If you're interested in a solid Western-based RPG, try this one out.
Number 7. Dragon Warrior 3.
Dragon Warrior 3, also known as Dragon Quest 3 in Japan, was developed by Chunsoft and published by Enix. This is the third and last game developed as part of the story that was originally introduced in Dragon Quest 1. However, this game itself is a prequel to that story. The game features some quality of life upgrades from its predecessors, such as better storage interface, automatic cleaning up of items gained, full healing to expedite the process, opening doors, etc. The game was a rather open world game, and strangely enough, it features a world that has geography strikingly similar to our own. The visuals were a slight upgrade from Dragon Warrior 2, but a massive upgrade from the original game. The game has a class system standard to RPGs, and you can go and recruit characters at a tavern to fill out the party. The game is an iteration on what came before it, and while introducing new quality of life aspects that would eventually become standard in role-playing games. Like others, this game has been ported to Game Boy Color along with added features. So if you want a prequel to Dragon Quest 1, then go play this game.
Number 6. Chrysalis.
This game was developed by SNK. My first exposure to this particular game was actually on the Game Boy Color, and I fell in love with it. The game is more action-based than your typical turn-based JRPG franchises. This game features 4 elemental swords, each which has their own ability. Although the game may sound fantasy, it's actually based in a post-apocalyptic setting 100 years after a nuclear war, so monsters are mutated creatures. The story is based on a science, fantasy, magic versus technology motif. It's not anything new, but it's fairly well done. The game itself actually is fantastic however you want to play it, but I suggest that you go and try the Game Boy Color remake.
Number 5. Final Fantasy III.
Another game released only in Japan initially, Final Fantasy III course corrects from Final Fantasy II a little bit and finds a happy medium between the original game and its sequel. The game expands on the job system and fully realizes it in the form that we know today, of the jobs being part of the crystal shards. It's one of the major aspects of all forthcoming Final Fantasy games. The battle systems cleaned up from previous installments and were introduced to special battle commands this time around. While Final Fantasy originally may have set the foundation, this game cements that series and what we think of today as a classic Final Fantasy game. The music's absolutely beautiful and has one of my favorite songs while traveling on the overworld. The game is also first to feature the iconic summons that have shaped the franchise into what it is today. If you want to check it out, there is a DS remake that's splendid, as well as an iOS port and a PSP remake.
Number 4. Fire Emblem.
This game as well was only released in Japan. Fire Emblem is a strategy game with your standard RPG fare. Only the hardcore gamers even knew about this series in the US until a little game called Super Smash Bros. Melee came along and introduced us to Marth and Roy, who hail from the Fire Emblem series. Marth in particular is from this game. The gameplay controls on a tactical grid rather than a traditional first or third person random battle view. The focus on the game is the strategy aspect completely, but it is wrapped around in a sort of fantasy RPG decor. Like most tactical RPGs, the story is relatively detailed compared to many of the other franchises on the list. If you're a diehard fan and want to see where the series started, play this game. If you can't get your hands on a translated copy, the game was remade most recently on the DS, which is known as Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon.
Number 3. Dragon Warrior.
Developed by Chunsoft, Dragon Warrior, also known as Dragon Quest in Japan, began its long-running series with this game. The story is very, very basic. You're the chosen hero who has to save the world, but it executes it very well. You can't talk about Dragon Warrior without mentioning the slime, the game's iconic enemy. What is more impressive is that the slime has actually changed very, very little over the different iterations of the game. The game itself is presented in a very basic manner without a whole bunch of RPG jargon. For instance, spells are named Hurt and Hurt More, but not hilarious. It's actually a fantastic game to cut your teeth on when looking for old school RPG fun. Now you are going to get a bunch of grinding here, but again, these are older games. We also have this game to thank for starting another little franchise that you may have heard of.
Number 2. Zelda 2.
This is a divisive game to say the least, and many of you probably wouldn't rate it nearly as high on the list, or even put it on the list at all. But if you've seen the Crystarium's introduction video, you're gonna know that this game holds a very, very special place in my heart, as it was the first game I ever played, and it influenced my life quite a bit, however silly that sounds. Anyway, the game is a huge departure from the previous entry in the series, opting for a more side-scrolling, top-down hybrid approach. It was very unique. Until Zelda Breath of the Wild comes out, this game is going to be the most RPG-y, that's not a word, of the Zelda games. The game has a notorious difficult spike near the beginning of the game. However, it can be overcome, as it sports superb controls that feel perfect when controlling Link. The game music also has cemented itself as a mainstay, even showing up today in popular games such as Super Smash Bros. If you're up for a little challenge, please give this game a try. It's fantastic.
Number 1. Final Fantasy.
Could there have been any other game to take this spot? Final Fantasy was created by Hironobu Sakaguchi as a last-ditch effort from Square, who was actually facing bankruptcy at the time. The game almost didn't get made at all until Dragon Quest was released to positive reception in Japan. While extremely archaic by today's designs, at the time it pretty much did everything right. The series gained fame very quickly in the US and completely overshadowed Dragon Quest, who was developed by Enix at the time. The story was actually fantastically deep compared to the other RPGs on the system at the time. It also establishes the well-known job system and battle system and distinct music that the series is known for. This is the first game of the series, and it started the foundation of the juggernaut franchise that we all know today. So here it sits atop the NES RPGs as king. If you enjoyed this top 10 video, guys, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do all that cool stuff. Really helps me out a bunch. But until next time, guys, keep on gaming.